Oregon is a big, fat favorite against Michigan State this week. And they should be.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, it is that time once again for Locked On Ducks. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view of the day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day and your number one source to stay up to date with the Ducks. This episode is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. That's America's number one sports book. You can place your first $5 bet and get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. I'll give you one way for the offense to improve, one way for the defense to improve, but I like what I have seen on the whole on both sides of the football through the first four games. Doesn't mean every moment has been perfect. Certainly, no team is perfect all the time. Do you think Georgia has a good defense? Georgia gave up 30 points in a half. I don't care if it was to Alabama. I guarantee you that's not acceptable by the Bulldog standards, and I think it's a pretty good team and a pretty darn good program. But let's talk about Michigan State. We'll get to individual standouts as well. One of my favorite segments to do during the season. Michigan State is not a great football team. However, they are better than UCLA. UCLA might very well be the worst team in the Big Ten. We could look back one day this calendar year and say, hey, look, UCLA only won one football game this year. That's a thing that could happen. We could look back and say they only won two. I don't think we'll look back and say they won any more than three. Is Michigan State a great team? No. As Duck fans, we should probably be grateful that we've got one of Michigan State's formerly top players in Derek Harmon. That guy's really, really good. He was not the only transfer portal departure this past season. Now they've added a couple players, but Oregon's a big favorite in this game, and indeed they should be. Michigan State started 3-0. They beat FAU by 6. They won at Maryland, road conference win. I'll give them credit for that. They shut out Prairie View 40-0. Last 2 weeks, they lost at Boston College, and then Ohio State housed them 38-7. I'll talk more about what Oregon needs to do in this game to give Duck fans confidence going into the big Ohio State game, which is, wait for it, next Saturday. That was quick. Remember all the time we spent talking about that over the summer? Remember all the different angles that we approached it here on the show? And it was pretty close. It's very close, which is exciting. But I like what I've seen from Oregon across the board. Not holistically with every single snap, every single play, every single quarter so far. But over the last two games, Oregon has settled my fears about what I saw from the Ducks in the first two games. And Boise State has helped with that as well by showing Boise State's a really good football team. And probably, though they're not locked into winning the Mountain West, but they're going to be one of the contenders in there. That's a good football team. They're in the top 25 for a reason. That's helped lessen it as well. I think Oregon coming out strong against UCLA was a really, really good thing to see. I know the first quarter was 7-3, but by halftime, Oregon had the game in hand. And that's what a team is capable, or what this team is capable of looking like. So if they play that way against Michigan State, who is a tougher opponent? The betting line reflects this. Oregon was a 25.5-point favorite on the road against UCLA. It's 24 right now, according to our friends at FanDuel, and they're at home. You get an advantage at home. It's usually depends. It's about 2 to 4 points per change of venue. So if it was 25.5 at UCLA, neutral site, that line's probably like 27 for the Ducks, and at Autzen Stadium, it's pushing 30 or so. But Michigan State presents a tougher challenge, but Oregon is a better team across the board. And I like the way this Oregon team is playing right now. They got off to strong starts in both the Oregon State and UCLA games offensively. Their first halves of football were darn near flawless, aside from a Dylan Gabriel pick six, which I'm not really worried about that being a recurring issue because it wasn't for him last year. It hasn't been in his career for the most part, and this guy's a veteran quarterback, so I don't think that's going to happen again. So I don't think the offense is lacking for execution. I think the defense is playing at a really high level. Oregon's got a lot more talent than Michigan State in this game. I feel good. Does Oregon cover that number 100% guaranteed? Maybe not. But maybe this ends up being a 34-17 game. I think the Michigan State offense, though, is going to struggle at Autzen Stadium to move the football. They put up just 7 points at home against Ohio State last week, a question I'll get to in more detail in just a moment. But overall, they don't have the weapons. Aiden Childs is learning on the job. Oregon fan, I put out a question to those of you that are Locked On Ducks insiders, who I very much appreciate. Link is in the description below for a free 14-day trial. And I said, hey, Oregon's a 24-point favorite. Do you think that's right? And mostly the responses I got were, I think it's a little bit too high. I don't know about this. And then I was going through the comments yesterday, and I get plenty of DMs from you out there, and I appreciate that because I love engaging with all of you Oregon fans out there, no matter what your opinion is on me or on the Ducks. And there was plenty of negativity out there. And I don't have that same level of concern, because I think Oregon has played good football for the last 2 games. And yes, I'd like to see them stack a third quality game, especially at home against Michigan State, going into the showdown with the Buckeyes next week. But overall, I feel good about how this Oregon team is playing. So they're better on paper, just like last week, but slightly different. They've got more talent at basically every single position group. I mean, literally took their best defensive lineman. Oregon's defensive line, better. Offensive line, better. Jack Velling's a good tight end with T-Ferg healthy, and it looks like he'll be okay. Dan Lanning said it was a precautionary measure to keep him out of the second half of that game against UCLA, which, again, goes with the theory I outlined on yesterday's show of felt like Oregon kind of took their foot off the gas and didn't need to, keep everybody in all the time. And, I think we got to that point. So, I think Oregon's in a good spot here. I don't think they're playing the best football that we've seen them play so far. Hopefully that's reserved for October 12th. That's of course what you need to have happen. And that leads me to this question that came in via Marty Marr, who is a Locked On Ducks insider. Appreciate you out there. Who has the better defense, Oregon or Ohio State? Interestingly enough, for everything you may have heard over the summer about, hey, the Big Ten plays better defense than the Pac-12. Well, maybe they just don't have great offenses. Maybe it's both. Well, Oregon right now is averaging just under 19 points per game, which isn't bad. It is a good place to be. There's really one guy responsible for that number being that high, and it's Ashton Jeanty. Everybody else hasn't done a whole heck of a lot. Just under 19 points a game is good for 6th in the Big Ten right now. Ohio State is averaging 6.8 points per game allowed. Their offense has scored 38 plus in all 4. The difference is, though Oregon hasn't played the toughest schedule in the world, it has been considerably stronger than the one that Ohio State has played so far. They have played, wait for it. I thought I had this pulled up. But Akron, Western Michigan, Marshall, and Michigan State. Now, they beat Michigan State 38-7. So we'll know for certain, or at least have a more accurate data point, whose defense is better with how Oregon performs this Saturday. They're at home. Defense has been playing well. You hold them to 10 points or fewer, and I feel like you can at least say Oregon's defense is on par with Michigan or with Ohio State's. Right now, I'd still give the edge towards the Buckeyes, even though they haven't played anybody that is any good. I think Boise State and, ironically, Oregon State might be better than Michigan State right now. I don't know. Michigan State, Oregon State would be a really, really fun football game for a lot of reasons, since Jonathan Smith is now the head coach in East Lansing. But I feel really good about where this Oregon defense is at. And I understand the thought on the question, like, hey, how are we matching up to Ohio State? Let's go one game at a time. Let's assess things from UCLA, look ahead to Michigan State, and talk about how Oregon can best put themselves in a position to succeed going into the Buckeyes game. Right now, and on paper coming into the year, I would have given the edge to Ohio State. I probably still would. I probably still would. Is it a massive edge? No. I don't think it is a huge, huge edge. But for those that want that one-to-one comparison, that opportunity is going to arrive this Friday night at Autzen Stadium under the lights against Sparty. Let me know your thoughts in the YouTube comments, or hit me up on X, formerly known as Twitter, at @McLaughlinCFB, or at Locked On Ducks. Like, comment, subscribe if you have not already. One way for the offense to improve, one way for the defense to improve. Those two things are coming up next. Time to highlight my Roy Player of the Week. Roy is a new platform that lets fans make contributions directly to their favorite athletes. Download Roy for iOS or Android and enter referral code LOCKEDON, and you'll automatically be entered into a sweepstakes to win $5,000 cash. No purchase necessary, void where prohibited. I could have gone a number of different directions with our Roy Player of the Week. Tez Johnson, Big 12, I believe he was co-offensive player of the week, 12 catches, over 100 yards, couple of touchdowns. Guy's a stud. Thought he would lead Oregon in receiving coming into this year. That is very much on track to be the case. He's Dylan Gabriel's favorite target, and you can give $100 to Tez Johnson on Roy. If you were impressed, as I was, with his performance on Saturday, you can show him some love. Just hop on Roy, throw in a few bucks. If everyone pitches in just $10, adds up fast for these guys, whoever you want to contribute to. So, get off the sidelines, get into the NIL game with Roy. That's what it allows you to do. It doesn't just have to be a collective thing or a donor thing or a university thing. You can get involved. Support the players, change the game with Roy. You change the game with Roy, I change shows with second segment sips. Always breathes a little bit of new life into me here. So, one way for the offense to improve, one way for the defense to improve. Which one should I start with? Spencer, do this one. Spencer, do that one. All right, we're going to go with the offense first. I have liked what I've seen from Oregon in the running game so far. If you look at Jordan James' yards per carry this year, he's done very well. If you look at the numbers he's put up, even when the running game, quote-unquote, struggled, okay, that doesn't deserve a quote-unquote. Even when the running game struggled against Idaho, 2.9 yards a carry, Jordan James' numbers, not that bad. Even against Boise State, when the offensive line didn't really figure it out until they, got to that starting unit in the second half, Jordan James' numbers, he's still around 100 yards. And he's just been right around that 100-yard mark in each of the first 4 games. And I think it's a credit to the offensive line starting to figure things out. And I think it's a credit to Jordan James. He has been the more productive back than Noah Whittington has so far, who I think has done a really, really good job. Looks healthy. Didn't have his best and most productive game, but we've seen him be a dynamic playmaker for the offense. You talk about the game he had against Oregon State. I think it was 7 for 64 and a touchdown. You talk about the kick return and almost holding the ball. The long kick return, not for a touchdown, but the long kick return that he had against Boise State. Oregon's running backs have been exactly what I expected them to be coming into the year. And Jordan James, he's running hard. He's running through tackles. And I go back again to RG3's comparison to Isaiah Pacheco of the Chiefs. I can't unsee it. That's what he looks like. And I think Lanning was asked about, the long runs, and he feels like they're, really close to breaking explosive plays in the run game. I think that's the biggest area where this offense can improve. Honorable mention here is get better with screen passes, because they have called them several times this year. They haven't really been that good, whether to a tight end and you think about the screen passes they had last year, they had a bunch of really good ones. They had a good one against USC, Pat Herbert, the long touchdown against Arizona State. So the screen passes come into play here, but on a more consistent basis, yeah, you'd love to see more chunk plays in the run game. And it's not that Oregon is getting pushed back and they're creating too many negative plays or that the running game is not effective. It's that outside of the Dylan Gabriel run, which was a great play design against Oregon State, have you seen a lot of big, long runs? No, I think part of that is that Jordan James is not necessarily a home run hitter. We've seen him break off long runs before. Think of the Washington State game a year ago, or yeah, I think that was probably the longest run of his career. It wasn't a touchdown. I don't remember exactly how long it was, but he's not the sort of guy who's looking to hit a home run. Like if you go to Oregon's 2025 recruiting class, De'Aaron Hill Jr., who's listed as an athlete, that's a home run hitter. DeAnthony Thomas was a home run hitter. Or, I think of Jordan James a little bit more in the Byron Marshall mold as a runner, in that he's very effective. He is very good. But is he going to break, Michael James, obviously, is he going to have a lot of 50, 60, 70-yard touchdown runs? So far, that hasn't been the case. Now, part of that might be on the offensive line. Part of that's also on Jordan. But part of that is also the fact that when he does get to the second level, he always feels like he's just a little bit, he just barely gets tripped up, or he's like, oh, he's right there if he just breaks that one tackle. I think eventually, as he continues to find his footing as Oregon's lead running back and continues to stay fresh because Noah Whittington and Jalen Lamar get carries and, keep his legs rested throughout the course of the season, yeah, I think he can break those long runs. So they haven't shown it yet, but this is, again, first world problems because Oregon has been able to run the football. Oregon has had the quick passing game we know, the intermediate passing game you saw against Oregon State, the downfield passing game was there against Boise State and against UCLA especially. I think the offense has been right about where I expected it to be. But can you see more explosive plays, 15 to 20 yards or more in the run game? Yeah. I think that's an area where the offense can improve. And then honorable mention, the screen passes. The screen passes, those are ones that you call with the intention of like, hey, if we call this against the right defense, this is going to be a 15 to 30 yard play. And they haven't been that so far. They've been productive. And aside from now, the Jalen Lamar screen pass against Oregon State aside, I'm just kind of talking about the UCLA game. They called a lot of screen passes. Lanning said that was part of the game plan. They did a fine job. It wasn't bad, just wasn't great. So that's one thing. On the defensive side, I don't know what notes do you have? Oregon's defensive line is nasty. Nasty. You're going to talk about them more in just a little bit. They get pressure on the quarterback. They stop the run. Tackling can improve a little. Not a lot, but a little. And I'm mostly thinking back to the Boise State game. Like, I've had very few qualms with the defense. Secondary, playing well. Defensive line, playing well. Now, here's the question I have, and here's where I landed on, my improvement point for the defense. Can they find consistent production on the interior of the defensive line outside of the top two? Is it always going to be Derek Harmon and Jamari Caldwell? Joel Klatt has talked about this on his podcast. Joel's, I think, does a great job, and his podcast is very much worth a listen. And he's not paying me to plug that. I just think that he is an informed and a really, really good college football commentator. But he was talking about Michigan's defense, and he felt that Michigan's defense was kind of losing its touch a little bit in the second half, particularly the defensive line against both USC and Minnesota, because their offense can't sustain drives, which is why depth on the defensive line really important. Oregon hasn't had the same level of rotation up front as they did a season ago. Now, part of that is I think you have better guys at the top. Well, not necessarily better than Brandon Dorlus, but, Popo and Casey Rogers and Taki Taimani, solid players for Oregon last year. Derek Harmon, Jamari Caldwell start over all those guys except for Dorlus if you put them on last year's team. So where does that depth come from? We saw Amari Washington break through, make a tackle for loss. Does he become a reliable number 4 defensive tackle? Which sounds, again, and it somewhat is like a first world defensive problem, but they rotate in pairs, or not exclusively per se. But if you start these two guys, you'd like to be able to say, hey, we'll bring this guy up, but then, we want to have someone to sub out the other guy that isn't the guy who just got subbed out. So like if Caldwell goes out for a few snaps and Washington comes in, you then want to give Derek Harmon a rest. You don't want to then have to say, hey, I know you just came up 2 snaps ago, Jamari, but we need you to go back in there because we don't feel good about somebody else. So that's what I look for in defense. How can they find consistency on the interior? I think the edge guys, as I'm going to talk about to wrap up today's show, have just been phenomenal. I mean, across the board, they're making plays, they're getting after the quarterback, pressure's there, sack numbers are there. I think they've done a really, really good job. But those would be my one areas for improvement on the offense and the defense. What do you think? Let me know in the YouTube comments or hit me up on X, formerly known as Twitter. One of my favorite segments every single year hosting this show. Only get to do it 12, 13 times a year because it can only happen after games. Individual standouts that are a little under the radar, or maybe not, that deserve a shout out. That is coming up next. After we talk about FanDuel. NFL fans, guess what? You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. That's America's number 1 sports book. Not 2, not 3, not 4, number 1. We're number 1. We're number 1. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. Oregon is minus 24, according to our friends at FanDuel, against Michigan State. Do you like that line? Do you think Oregon's getting too much credit? Do you think Michigan State hangs around and makes this uncomfortable at the end? Michigan State plus 24 is available to bet. Do you think Oregon steamrolls and does to the Spartans what they did to the Beavs and just run them off the field? Well, by all means. Oregon minus 24 available to bet, along with everything you could possibly want for college football. Again, that's $200 in bonus bets with your first $5 bet at FanDuel.com. All right, I love this segment. I really do. Individual standouts from this past week's game. Couldn't do it on last week's set of shows. Why? Because there was no game. But alas, we don't have that issue and won't again until the middle of November. Can you tell me off the top of your head when Oregon's next bye is? I do. I can do that. How many of you can do that? Scouts honor. Don't look. Let me know in the comments. Jeff Bassa's first. Jeff Bassa is a difference maker for this Oregon defense in more ways than one. Leadership, communication, impact. The leadership and communication components have been there through the first few games, but the bye week came at a really good time, and I talked about it, and I think we saw it on the field Saturday night against UCLA. He wasn't a menace in the tackling department per se. Oregon's tackles were pretty well spread out, but Jeff Bassa having a sack, having a pass breakup, just seeing him make impact plays was a refreshing thing to see, even if it's against UCLA, because he got dinged up against Idaho. He didn't have a good game against Boise State, and he was kind of there, but on a snap count against Oregon State. This is a guy who Oregon's defense, to be at its very best, needs to be 100% healthy, and he needs to be playing good football. You have to have him there. Bryce Betcher, awesome. If Bryce Betcher's your number 2 back with how he's playing football right now, your defense is in a really, really good spot. And if Devin Jackson's your number 3, that's an awesome place to be. Rotate those guys in and out, throw in a Justin Jacobs. I like that linebacker rotation a lot. But it was really, really refreshing to see Jeffrey Bassa just play like Jeffrey Bassa again. So that's the first guy who I think deserves a shout out. Stick on the defensive side. Jordan Burch, monster. This is a guy who came back for his 4th and final year of college football. Second with the Ducks. He transferred from South Carolina once upon a time. And has some positional versatility because he's so big. Like, he's kind of in that Brandon Dorlus mold in that he can play inside, he can play outside, and he does move around. He's a force to be reckoned with. And he had a drive in, I think it was the second half of the game. I might have that wrong off the top of my head, where he had a tackle for loss, and then he had a sack on consecutive plays. Which should be separate stats. I'm not having that YouTube comment debate. So many people, I got a shocking amount of engagement in the YouTube comments on my comment about tackles for loss and sacks and why they need to be separate stats rather than a sack counting as a tackle for loss. Like if you tackle a running back behind the line of scrimmage for a 2-yard loss, that's a TFL but not a sack. So you have 1 TFL. If you then sack the quarterback, you get 1 sack and 1 TFL. But you haven't made 3 plays, you've made 2. Anyway, I got a shocking amount of people who were like, oh, well, it's this way, or it's that way, or it should be this, it should be that. This makes sense. It doesn't make sense. I agree with you. I wasn't expecting that. I really wasn't. But Jordan Burch is someone who I expected to have a big year because he's kind of trying to prove it. You know, in the NFL, this gets portrayed correctly. Portrayed's not the right word. It gets relayed to the mass audiences as a contract year. Like, his contract is up and he's playing for a better contract or another really good contract. He has to have a good season. Well, Jordan Burch is playing for a contract, that being his NFL draft stock. Higher you get drafted, more money you can make, more security you have and whatnot. He's playing for that this year. I think it's one of the reasons, though there were certainly several others, why he came back, is that he has NFL draft potential, but he has not maximized it yet. He was a big-time recruit coming out of high school, and he was an impact player in this game for Oregon. The sequence in which he went, tackle for loss and then sack on back-to-back plays, that was not the only time he made an impact, but that was the moment where you're like, hey, Jordan Burch taking over here. That's a great thing to see because he's the veteran leader for this defensive line. There's a bunch of young talent up there. Now, Derek Harmon falls in that category as well, but he's the veteran leader who was on last year's team, and I love seeing him play well. So Jordan Burch, definitely gets one. Here's an under the radar one. And, I could shout out a guy like Tez, who I talked about, or Jordan James played well, or, Gabriel, aside from the pick six, was good. But this was an under the radar play that I don't know if a lot of people remember, but it definitely stood out to me because I've kind of been the de facto head of this guy's fan club for the last couple of years as he struggled to see the field. He's clearly carved out a role for himself, and that's Kyler Casper. So Kyler Casper on a 3rd and goal, because he's 6'6", they ran this package against Oregon State, and they brought it out again against UCLA. They go bunch to one side and have a route concept, and then they isolate Casper, and Gabriel makes a read to see if he wants to take a one-on-one on the fade route, because Kyler Casper is 6'6", has a big frame. This is his 3rd year of college football, and he's a red zone threat. That's one of the reasons I liked him as a recruit. Like, hey, Oregon hasn't had a lot of wide receivers like that. You did that to Troy Franklin maybe every now and then, but that wasn't, the MO of his game. It's not something that Evan Stewart can do because he's a little bit shorter, though he's a dynamic playmaker as well. But this is something that Casper brings to the table that a lot of other receivers just can't because he's 6'5", 6'6". Well, on 3rd and goal, Dylan Gabriel's got the trust to throw the ball in his direction. And no, he doesn't catch a touchdown, but he draws a pass interference because he's just hard to handle. That then sets up Oregon 1st and goal, and they score a touchdown. So that was an important sequence for Oregon because if he, checks out of the play or if he doesn't get that flag, Oregon might have to kick a field goal. And those who are really, really worried in the YouTube comments might feel even worse about Oregon's offense. So I thought that deserved a shout out because I watched that and thought Kyler Casper just got Oregon 4 points. That's what that play is. It's not going to show up on the stat sheet, but it's going to show up right here on this episode of Locked On Ducks. Speaking of the defensive line, flipping over to the other side of the ball, Amari Washington, first tackle for loss, looked great. That play was like, whew, okay. Amongst the 2023 recruits along the defensive line last year, he led Oregon in snaps amongst that particular group of individuals. Looks like he's the young guy that's working his way into the fold. Curious to see how much he plays going forward, but he's played a pretty good amount this year. He's been one of the rotation guys on the interior of that defensive line, and if Oregon can continue to get production from him, that'd be a really, really good thing for this defensive line, as I was talking about earlier on the show. And I also want to shout out Jaden Moore. So this has been kind of a surprise move to a lot of us who talk about Oregon depth charts and such, because Jaden Moore, 2023 recruit as well, coming off the edge, looks awesome. He's in there in pass rushing situations. Looks like he's catapulted himself past Blake Purchase and has kept himself ahead of Elijah Rushing. And, I don't expect true freshmen to play along the defensive line. Thibodeau did, and, you could see it every now and then, but it's just really, really hard to be ready to go up against guys at that level. Moore's a redshirt freshman, or a sophomore. I'm pretty sure he redshirted last year. And he looks like he's just moved past Purchase, and he looks really good. He looks fast. He looks twitchy. He looks big enough to be out there. And he's made a couple of nice plays. I don't think he's had anything show up on the stat sheet yet. He might have had at least a quarterback pressure against Oregon State, if not a pass deflection. But that might have been Derek Harmon that got his hand on it. But Jaden Moore was right there next to him. So love seeing the young guys get into the fold, because you want to have depth for now. You want to have depth for the future as well. Like, comment, subscribe, please and thank you if you have not already. Thanks for making this your first listen. Go make Locked On College Football your second. I host over there, giving you the biggest stories in the greatest sport on planet Earth. Appreciate everyone listening. I'll see you next time. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and go Ducks.